What happens when Mark Wahlberg refuses to back down from Whoopi Goldberg on live television? What happens when a morning talk show meant for light debate turns into a battlefield of pride, principle, and raw emotion? Before we dive into this explosive moment, make sure you subscribe to Stage View right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Because today's story isn't just another celebrity interview. It's a collision you have to experience from the inside. The lights inside the studio of The View were bright enough to bleach out hesitation. The audience buzzed with that familiar daytime TV energy. Polite applause, scattered laughter, the rustle of cue cards and whispered production notes. It was supposed to be another promotional stop. Another actor. Another round of questions. But something in the air felt different. Mark stepped out first, dressed sharp but understated, dark blazer, crisp white shirt, the kind of controlled presence that said he knew exactly who he was. He smiled, waved, nodded toward the audience. Applause swelled. Some cheers were louder than the rest. Then Whoopi leaned back in her chair, hands folded, eyes calculating. She'd done this for decades. She'd seen politicians crumble and celebrities charm their way out of uncomfortable questions. Nothing surprised her anymore. Or so she thought. The introductions rolled smoothly. A clip from Mark's latest project played on the massive screen behind them. Explosions, grit, intensity. The crowd clapped again. He thanked them. He looked relaxed. For the first few minutes, it was easy. Safe questions. Childhood memories. Fitness routines. A joke about Boston. Laughter. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, engaging, charismatic. Whoopi even cracked a smile. Then she shifted. Her voice dropped just slightly, almost imperceptibly. Mark, you've always been outspoken. You've said some things over the years that stirred controversy. Some people feel you've tried to rewrite parts of your past. How do you respond to critics who say you haven't fully owned up? The audience shifted in their seats. Mark blinked once. Just once. He nodded slowly. I've addressed my past many times, he said evenly. I was young. I made mistakes. I've worked hard to grow. Whoopi didn't look satisfied. But growth, she pressed, isn't just about saying you've changed. It's about accountability. Some would argue you've benefited from forgiveness that others don't receive. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mark's jaw tightened, almost invisibly. His smile faded, not in anger but in resolve. He leaned back this time, mirroring her posture. Are you saying I haven't taken accountability? He asked, voice calm but firm. I'm asking, Whoopi replied, eyes locked on his. If you think you've done enough. There it was. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. One of the co-hosts shifted uncomfortably. Another forced a polite half-smile. The producers backstage exchanged glances. Mark didn't laugh it off. He didn't deflect. No, he said. I think I've done what I can. I've apologized. I've changed my life. I've invested in communities. I've tried to be better. But I can't live chained to mistakes I made decades ago. The audience reaction split. Half applause, half silence. Whoopi leaned forward now. But isn't that the point? Some people don't get to move on so easily. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in hostility, but in focus. You're right, he said. Some don't. And that's wrong. But holding me in the past forever doesn't fix that system. There was an edge to his voice now. Controlled. Intentional. The co-host to Whoopi's right jumped in, trying to lighten it. Okay, we're getting serious this morning. A few laughs. Thin ones. But Whoopi didn't let it go. You're a powerful man now, she continued. Your voice carries weight. Don't you think that means you have to accept ongoing scrutiny? Mark inhaled slowly. You could see it, the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He was done playing defense. I accept scrutiny, he said. What I don't accept is being reduced to a headline from 30 years ago every time I sit down somewhere. At some point, growth has to count. The applause this time was louder. Whoopi's expression hardened, just slightly. Growth counts, but so does impact. And I agree, Mark shot back. But impact goes both ways. If someone spent decades trying to do better, shouldn't that matter too? The air felt electric. A camera zoomed in on Whoopi's face. She held his gaze unblinking. The kind of stare that had made senators squirm. You think you're being unfairly targeted? She asked. Mark leaned forward again. No, I think I'm being asked to relive a version of myself that doesn't exist anymore. The audience let out an audible, oh. One of the co-hosts looked down at her cards. Another whispered something off mic. Whoopi crossed her arms. So what would you say, she asked quietly, to someone who still feels hurt? Mark's voice softened, but it didn't waver. I'd say I'm sorry. Again. And I'd say I'm trying. Every day. But I can't change who I was. I can only control who I am now. For a split second, something shifted in the room. The tension cracked, not completely, but enough to let emotion seep through. Whoopi studied him. Really studied him. You're asking for grace, she said. I'm asking for fairness, Mark replied. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't happen on daytime television. Then a clap. One person. Then another. Then a wave of applause that rolled across the studio like thunder. But Whoopi didn't clap. She looked into the camera instead. Conversations like this matter, she said, voice measured. Because accountability and redemption are complicated. And not everyone agrees on where that line is. Mark nodded. That's true. But his eyes told a different story. He wasn't backing down. Not from her. Not from the narrative. Not from the implication that he hadn't done enough. As the segment cut to commercial, the music swelled, but the tension didn't disappear. Mark and Whoopi exchanged a few quiet words off mic. No smiles. No visible hostility either. Just intensity. Backstage, producers scrambled. Social media was already lighting up. Clips were being uploaded in real time. Hashtags forming before the commercial break even ended. When the cameras came back on, the energy had changed. The easy laughter was gone. And everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, knew this wasn't over. Because Mark Wahlberg had just done something rare on live television. He'd refused to retreat. And Whoopi Goldberg had no intention of letting the moment fade quietly. What happened next would push the conversation from uncomfortable to unforgettable. The applause faded, but the tension didn't. The red light blinked back on inside the studio of The View, and the audience straightened in their seats as if bracing for impact. What had started as a measured debate had shifted into something far more personal. You could feel it in the silence between breaths. Mark sat upright now, no longer leaning casually into the conversation. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, knuckles faintly pale under the studio lights. Across the table, Whoopi's posture was still relaxed, but her eyes were sharp, scanning him, weighing him. Let's keep going, Whoopi said calmly, turning back from the camera to face him. Because this isn't just about the past. It's about power. The word hung in the air. Mark didn't interrupt. You're one of the most successful actors in Hollywood, she continued. You've built businesses. You've built influence. When someone with that level of power talks about fairness, people listen. So what responsibility do you think you carry? A co-host shifted beside her, sensing the tightening rope between them. Mark exhaled slowly. A lot, he admitted. I carry a lot of responsibility. As a father. As a businessman. As a public figure. But, Whoopi pressed. But I also believe responsibility doesn't mean self-erasure. A ripple passed through the audience. Whoopi tilted her head. Explain that. Mark's voice deepened, not louder, but steadier. It means I can acknowledge where I've failed without allowing that failure to define my entire existence. I don't think growth requires me to constantly tear myself down. One of the co-hosts jumped in. No one's asking you to tear yourself down. Mark turned slightly toward her. When every conversation circles back to who you were at your worst, it starts to feel like that. The air felt heavier now. Whoopi didn't blink. Or, she countered, it feels like accountability doesn't expire. There it was again, that razor edge. Mark leaned back, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. Accountability doesn't expire. But neither should redemption. A few audience members clapped instinctively. Others remained silent, watching carefully, almost afraid to tip the balance. Whoopi's voice softened, but only slightly. Redemption isn't self-declared. Mark's jaw flexed. It's not self-denied either. For a split second, the room felt like it might split in two. One co-host attempted a nervous laugh. Well, this is getting philosophical. But no one laughed with her. Whoopi folded her hands on the table. Mark, there are people who feel that when celebrities talk about moving on, it sounds like privilege. Like it's easier for some to move forward than others. Mark nodded slowly. That's a fair feeling. But, she said again, but my moving forward doesn't stop someone else from demanding justice in their own life, he replied. I can advocate for fairness systemically while also acknowledging that I'm not the same person I was. Whoopi leaned forward. Then why does it seem like you bristle when it's brought up? The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Mark paused. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. He looked down briefly, just a flicker, before meeting her eyes again. Because, he said quietly, it's not brought up as a conversation. It's brought up as a verdict. The audience reacted audibly this time, gasps, murmurs, a wave of whispers. Whoopi's expression hardened just a fraction. You think I'm delivering a verdict? I think, Mark replied evenly, that sometimes the framing assumes I haven't done the work. And I have. His voice carried a note of frustration now. Not explosive, but unmistakable. One of the co-hosts interjected carefully. Do you feel misunderstood? Mark turned toward her. I feel reduced. Silence. Reduced. The word echoed. Whoopi's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Reduced to what? To a headline, he said. To a mistake. To a narrative that doesn't allow complexity. Whoopi didn't look away. Complexity doesn't erase harm. I never said it did, Mark shot back, sharper this time. The audience reacted immediately, an audible intake of breath. The first real spark of confrontation. A producer's voice faintly crackled somewhere off stage, probably urging them to pivot, to soften. But neither of them moved. Whoopi's voice stayed level. No one here is accusing you of denying harm. Mark leaned forward again. But the implication is that nothing I've done since matters enough. The co-host to Whoopi's left finally spoke, her tone cautious. Mark, is it possible that the discomfort you feel is part of the accountability process? Mark turned to her, considering. Discomfort is fine. I live with it. But perpetual condemnation? That's different. The words hit harder than he perhaps intended. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted slightly. Condemnation? Yes, he said firmly. Because when someone's past is brought up every single time, without acknowledging growth, it feels less like discussion and more like branding. The audience broke into scattered applause again. Whoopi let the noise settle before responding. You're saying you've been branded. I'm saying people are more than their worst moments, Mark replied. All of us. There was something in his voice now, an edge of vulnerability layered beneath the steel. Whoopi studied him carefully. For a moment, the confrontation shifted into something almost introspective. And what if someone watching, she said slowly, feels that the system forgave you faster than it forgave them? Mark didn't hesitate this time. Then the system is broken, he said. Not my attempt to grow. The audience erupted, half applause, half stunned silence. Whoopi didn't smile, but she didn't interrupt either. The cameras zoomed in tighter. The tension was no longer just between two public figures. It had become ideological, philosophical, personal. Let me ask you this, Whoopi said quietly. If someone says they're still angry, still hurt, do you accept that? Yes, Mark said immediately. And if they never forgive you? His voice lowered. I'd have to accept that too. That answer seemed to shift something. The room exhaled slightly. But Whoopi wasn't finished. Then why fight so hard right now? She asked. Why not just nod and move on? Mark's eyes flashed, not with anger but conviction. Because, he said, leaning in one final time, there's a difference between listening and silently agreeing with a narrative that says I'm permanently defined by who I was at 19. The audience clapped louder than before. One co-host finally smiled, sensing the crescendo. Okay, that's a statement. Whoopi held his gaze for several long seconds. The kind of silence that feels like it stretches time itself. You're not backing down, she observed. Mark's expression didn't change. No, he said. I'm not. And in that moment, the studio felt less like a talk show and more like a courtroom without a judge. No clear winner. No clean resolution. Just two powerful voices refusing to yield. As the segment edged toward its end, Whoopi turned toward the camera again. These conversations are uncomfortable, she said, measured but firm. But they're necessary. Mark nodded. Agreed. But the agreement felt fragile. The closing music began to rise, signaling the end of the segment. The audience applauded, louder now, energized, divided, stirred. As the cameras faded out once more, Mark and Whoopi remained seated, still facing each other. Neither smiling, neither retreating. And backstage, producers knew what everyone else already sensed. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a line drawn in real time. And when they came back from the next break, that line was about to be tested even further. When the show returned from break, the applause felt thinner. Not because the audience wasn't engaged, but because they were listening more carefully now. The set of The View looked the same. The bright table, the skyline backdrop, the polished mugs. But the energy had shifted from daytime chatter to something raw and unscripted. Whoopi adjusted her glasses slowly, her voice calm but deliberate. Before we move on, she said, I want to make something clear. This isn't personal. It's about the larger conversation. Across from her, Mark Wahlberg nodded once. I understand that. But the tension between understanding and agreement was razor thin. One of the co-hosts attempted to pivot. Mark, you've talked about growth. What does that actually look like behind the scenes? It was a lifeline, a softer entry point. Mark took it, but he didn't soften. It looks like showing up, he said. It looks like investing time and money into communities that need support. It looks like mentoring kids who remind me of who I used to be, and making sure they don't make the same mistakes. There was sincerity in his voice now, a grounding force that steadied the room. Whoopi listened carefully. And do you ever think, she asked, that part of that mentorship includes sitting in discomfort publicly? Mark gave a faint, almost tired smile. You think this is comfortable? A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, real this time. Whoopi's lips curved slightly. Fair point. But she didn't retreat. I'm asking because when public figures resist hard questions, it can look like defensiveness. Mark's posture straightened again. There's a difference between defensiveness and drawing a boundary. The word boundary hit differently. Whoopi leaned back. So this is a boundary? Yes, he said plainly. I won't deny my past. I won't excuse it. But I won't accept the idea that I'm forever stuck in it either. The co-host to Whoopi's right finally jumped in more firmly. But Mark, isn't that part of being a public figure? That your story, good and bad, is always up for discussion. Mark turned toward her. Discussion? Yes. Condemnation disguised as discussion? No. The audience murmured again, sensing the spark reigniting. Whoopi's tone cooled. You keep using the word condemnation. Because that's how it feels, Mark replied. When I come here to talk about my work, my family, my present life, and the focus shifts immediately to who I was decades ago. Whoopi's eyes sharpened. You think we shouldn't ask about it? I think, he said carefully, that context matters. Balance matters. A brief silence followed. Then Whoopi did something unexpected. She turned fully toward him, hands flat on the table. Mark, she said, her voice lower than before, do you think I'm being unfair? The question cut through the studio like a blade. The audience froze. Mark didn't answer immediately. He studied her face, not as a host, not as an icon, but as a person. The weight of the moment pressed against him. One wrong word, and it would explode. I think, he began slowly, that sometimes the tone of these conversations assumes guilt is permanent. Whoopi didn't blink. And you don't believe it is? I believe actions have consequences, he said. But I also believe in transformation. Transformation doesn't erase impact, she replied. And I've never claimed it does, Mark said, his voice firmer now. But it should matter. The room felt tight again, like a drum stretched too far. One of the co-hosts glanced toward the producers off stage, clearly aware this was no longer a routine segment. Whoopi's voice rose just slightly, not yelling, but carrying more force. It does matter, but you don't get to decide how much it matters to other people. Mark's eyes flashed. And other people don't get to decide that I haven't changed. The audience reacted instantly, gasps, scattered applause, a few audible wow-s. This was no longer philosophical. It was personal. Whoopi's expression hardened. No one said you haven't changed. It's implied, Mark replied, his voice steady but intense. When the conversation circles back, as if nothing else defines me. The co-host on the far end finally spoke, her voice cautious but firm. Mark, do you think maybe the reason it keeps coming up is because it still resonates with people? He turned to her. I understand that, but resonance shouldn't mean repetition without recognition of growth. The words landed heavy. Whoopi folded her arms. So what would recognition look like to you? Mark didn't hesitate this time. It would look like acknowledging the work I've done without framing it as insufficient before the conversation even starts. A beat of silence. Whoopi held his gaze. You're asking for credit. I'm asking for fairness, he corrected again. There it was, the line he refused to abandon. The audience was fully divided now. Some nodded along with him. Others sat stiffly, arms crossed, clearly siding with Whoopi's insistence on relentless accountability. Whoopi leaned forward one last time. You know why this matters, right? She asked quietly. Because people watching at home don't all get redemption arcs. They don't all get comeback stories. So when they see someone who does, they question it. Mark's expression softened, but his voice did not. Then let's question the system, he said. Not the possibility of change. The room erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Thunder. Even a few audience members stood. Whoopi didn't clap, but she didn't interrupt either. She let the noise wash over them both. When it finally quieted, she spoke again, calmer, steadier. I respect that you're not backing down. Mark met her eyes. I respect that you're asking hard questions. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement. The co-host beside Whoopi exhaled audibly. Well, this is definitely one for the highlight reel. A small wave of laughter broke the tension, but the atmosphere remained charged, like lightning still flickering behind distant clouds. As the segment drew toward its final moments, Whoopi turned to the camera. Conversations about accountability and redemption are messy, she said. They're emotional, and they don't always end neatly. Mark nodded beside her. But they matter, he added. The music began to rise again, signaling the show's close. The audience applauded, louder than ever now. But as the cameras pulled back, capturing the full table, one thing was clear. No one in that room would forget this exchange. Not the audience. Not the co-hosts. Not the producers frantically checking social media feeds, lighting up with clips of Whoopi Goldberg and Mark Wahlberg locked in a battle of conviction. And certainly not Mark himself. Because he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't stormed off. He hadn't apologized for defending his growth. He had simply refused to retreat. And as the studio lights dimmed and the applause faded into backstage whispers, one question lingered heavier than all the rest. What happens after a live television standoff like this? Because off camera, the real fallout was only just beginning. The cameras shut off, but the silence that followed inside the studio of The View was louder than anything that had aired. For a brief second, no one moved. The applause had ended. The theme music had faded. The audience members were being directed toward the exits, but many lingered, whispering intensely to each other, replaying moments in hushed tones. At the table, Mark Wahlberg and Whoopi Goldberg remained seated. No smiles, no performative warmth, just two people who had refused to yield. Mark broke the stillness first. He leaned slightly toward Whoopi, his voice low, off-mic but firm. I meant what I said. Whoopi didn't flinch. I know you did. There was no sarcasm in her tone. No hostility either. Just acknowledgement. You came ready, she added. Mark gave a small nod. So did you. For a split second, something unspoken passed between them. Mutual respect forged in friction. But respect didn't erase what had just happened. Backstage, producers were already huddled around monitors. Phones buzzed relentlessly. Clips were spreading across social platforms at lightning speed. Within minutes, headlines were forming. Wahlberg pushes back live. Whoopi challenges Mark in heated exchange. Redemption versus accountability on daytime TV. The debate had escaped the studio walls. In the hallway, a junior producer whispered, "It's trending already." Another responded, "Of course it is." Because what viewers had witnessed wasn't shouting. It wasn't chaos. It was something more unsettling. Conviction. Mark walked toward his dressing room with controlled steps, but inside, his thoughts were racing. He replayed the moment Whoopi had asked, "You're not backing down?" And his answer, no. He hadn't raised his voice. But he had drawn a line. Inside her own dressing room, Whoopi removed her glasses slowly and stared at her reflection. She had asked the questions she believed mattered. She had pressed where she felt pressure was needed. But she knew what the headlines would say. Some would call her relentless. Others would call her unfair. She'd lived through worse storms. But this one felt different. Not because of what was said, but because of how evenly matched it had been. By the time Mark's car pulled away from the studio, social media had fractured into two camps. Clips of him saying, "Redemption shouldn't expire," were being shared with captions praising his composure. Others highlighted Whoopi's line, "You don't get to decide how much it matters to other people." Comment sections ignited. Mark handled that with class. Whoopi was right to press him. He didn't dodge. She didn't let him. News outlets began dissecting body language. Commentators debated tone. Reaction videos multiplied by the hour. And then something unexpected happened. A longer clip surfaced, one that showed the final off-air exchange where Mark had said, "I respect that you're asking hard questions," and Whoopi had replied, "I respect that you're not backing down." It changed the temperature slightly. The narrative wasn't about a meltdown. It was about a clash. That evening, pundits replayed the footage frame by frame. Some argued Mark had reclaimed control of his public image. Others insisted Whoopi had fulfilled her role by refusing to soften the conversation. But the most powerful reactions weren't coming from celebrities or journalists. They were coming from ordinary viewers. Parents, students, people who had made mistakes and were trying to move beyond them. People who felt the system had never offered them a second chance. The conversation shifted from two famous names to something broader. What does redemption look like? Who decides when someone has done enough? And does growth deserve recognition, or simply expectation? Late that night, Mark posted a short message online. Growth is a lifelong process. I'm committed to it. No attack. No defense. Just a statement. Hours later, Whoopi addressed it briefly on her own platform. Hard conversations are necessary. That's how we move forward. Neither apologized. Neither escalated. And somehow, that restraint amplified everything. The next morning, the studio returned to normal. New guests. New topics. New applause. But there was an undercurrent now, a reminder that live television can still produce unscripted truth. When Whoopi sat back at the table the following day, she referenced the moment carefully. Yesterday sparked a lot of discussion, she said. And that's okay. She didn't walk it back. She didn't double down. She let it breathe. Across the country, Mark was asked about it during another interview. The host tried to bait him. Was it tense? He paused. It was honest, he replied. And that single word reframed everything. Because honesty is messy. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit neatly into applause lines or outrage headlines. What happened on that stage wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to retreat. Mark refused to back down from defending his growth. Whoopi refused to back down from demanding accountability. And in the collision between those two stances, something rare happened on daytime television. A real conversation. Not polished. Not pretty. Not resolved, but real. Weeks later, the clip still circulated. University classrooms used it in discussions about public image and restorative justice. Podcast hosts debated whether redemption in the public eye is ever truly possible. Fans on both sides continued arguing in comment threads that refused to die. The moment had outgrown the show. It had become a mirror reflecting how divided and how thoughtful people can be when confronted with the idea that no one is frozen in time. In the end, no one stormed off stage. No one shouted. No one won. But everyone felt it. And that's why it mattered. Now I want to hear from you. Was Mark right to stand firm and defend his growth? Or was Whoopi right to keep pressing, refusing to soften the weight of the past? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation. And if you want more explosive, emotional, behind-the-scenes stories that pull you inside the moment like this one, make sure you subscribe to Stage View right now. Because sometimes the most powerful battles aren't fought with volume. They're fought with conviction. And you never know who will refuse to back down next.